Since the coronavirus began, the US Federal Reserve, one of many central banks, has printed an additional $2 trillion US dollars. That's a third of all US currency currently in circulation. A third of US dollars in existence printed in 1 year alone. And there's more to come, much more, with Joe Biden waking up once or twice a month to announce trillions and trillions in new spending. Now, anybody who doesn't think this is a problem, well, they're out of their minds. But one person who does take this seriously is the legendary novelist and Spectator columnist Lionel Shriver. 5 years ago, she warned about a future economic crisis in The Mandibles, A Family 2029-2047. That's a dystopian novel about the complete societal collapse as a result of the US defaulting on its debt. Now, it not only is a brilliant novel, which you absolutely must read, it's also exceptionally well researched and a wake-up call to anyone who says that debt doesn't matter. And now, 5 years later, it's looking highly and terrifyingly relevant. So it's an honour to welcome onto the show Lionel Shriver. Miss Shriver, how are you?
I'm surviving.
Aren't we all in this year of our Lord 2021? Now, before we get into The Mandibles, which I'm really keen to talk about, let's talk a little bit about, the cultural collapse before we get to economic collapse, and your latest piece in The Spectator about the extraordinary self-flagellation that the Western world, America and the UK and so on, but also Australia where I am, is going down. And it has to be asked, how can any country or indeed civilization survive when there's nobody around who wants to defend it anymore?
Well, I was trying to call attention in my most recent column to the fact that when the Western left hair shirts its way around and talks about how terrible we are and what an awful history we have, how racist we are, and other people are listening. And in particular, China is listening. And, I don't admire or wish to copy the nature of Chinese nationalism. It actually makes my skin crawl. All those dancers in unison and they can come across as brainwashed, frankly. So I'm glad that we have a more elastic understanding of what patriotism means. And I appreciate both in Britain and in the US, where I'm obviously from, the right to not be patriotic, right? That's something that is an option. Nobody makes you wave a flag. And you do indeed have the freedom to criticize your country and your government and to trash it. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't have the freedom to do that, but I think that we should be more mindful of what it looks like when we take full advantage of that privilege to be down on our own country. And, we've got a strange inversion going on right now, whereby to be very down on your country and to, for white people, even to denigrate your entire race is to make a bid for status, right? Mm-hmm. It makes you better. Now that may work in terms of internal political dynamics for whatever weird reasons, but it really doesn't work in an international context to the Chinese and for that matter, to the Russians as well. It just looks like weakness. It looks like you don't believe in yourself. And it reminds me of, how it is, you can be very critical of your own family. And when siblings are talking about parents, it can be incredibly cruel. But it's like, if someone overheard, you'd say, well, and chimed in and said, yeah, your parents are terrible. You'd get your back up.
Yeah, that's right.
So, and I'm afraid that we're living in a world where everyone is listening in. And so that you have to be mindful of that, and a little tempering of the vitriol and a little more appreciation of what your own country has going for it among the many things that you are allowed to be so negative about the country. I mean, it's not in our larger self-interest. I mean, I did a speech for the Ramsey Center, which dovetails with this thinking. And it was saying that I fear that we're suffering from a larger historical complacency in the West. As much as many little turmoils we've been through since World War II, but not the kind of big kind that happened in the middle of the last century. And we've been fundamentally prosperous. Most of the wars we've fought have been off of our own territory. And we just take it for granted that everything's going to be fine. So that makes it possible to go out in the street and burn things down because we just assume that somebody else is going to build them back up again. And we'll always, be able to get updates on our iPhones.
Look, I agree with you. The right to dissent is extremely important. That is a privilege that we have in the West that we should be grateful for. But when you have the President of the United States talking about this, frankly, myth of systemic racism and acknowledging the orthodoxies of the extreme left. I mean, you said in the article yourself, the bizarre confrontation between the US and China in Alaska, where the US quite reasonably and quite importantly raised very real human rights issues, shaving the heads of Uyghur Muslims and busing them into concentration camps. They didn't have a leg to stand on because the US has already trumpeted its own injustice to the world.
Yeah, I thought that statement by Biden, which I think he's made more than once, about how the US is systemically racist, was a terrible mistake on every possible level. I mean, first of all, it means he's rhetorically throwing in his lot with the far left and all that identity politics nonsense. Big mistake. It's not really acknowledging what the role of the American presidency is. I mean, he is supposed to go out and represent the country, and to simply take on a role of shame and apology is not in the country's larger interest. And that was on display, as I noted in the column, when the Secretary of State met in a bilateral summit in Alaska recently. And, the Secretary of State was very brief in his criticism of China, only to get this lengthy harangue about how the U.S. didn't have a moral leg to stand on, and that the U.S. itself said that the U.S. is racist and full of all these failings in its own terms. It was just using that internal conversation against the country in an external context.
You've been very critical of Trump. I'm a little bit more of a Trump supporter, to put it mildly, but, going to Biden and the transition that happened there, to me seems a bit like a von Hindenburg, an aging, however statesman-like he is or was. I don't think he's capable of rising to the challenge that the times bring. And you mentioned complacency, and that's the perfect segue into The Mandibles. Now, this is a novel that you wrote 5 years ago. It is a dystopian novel. Well, I don't want to gush, I don't want to be a fanboy, but this is, I think, the most important novel.
Oh, go ahead.
Very well, if you insist. Look, I think this is the most important novel of the 21st century. It's the Atlas Shrugged of our times, and it very realistically paints the picture of total economic collapse following years of mounting debt, following the default on that debt, following the money printing, inflation, hyperinflation, and so on. Now, fast forward to 5 years after you wrote the book, you see the Biden administration creating trillions more dollars out of thin air. How nervous are you watching what's going on now versus when you wrote the book?
I'm extremely anxious, and I think that the texture of that anxiety has changed, because obviously I was worried about growing U.S. debt. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book, and I was also alarmed by having gone through the financial crisis of 2008, as were we all. Were we paying attention? But now the debt situation seems much more immediate. And my biggest concern is that in setting that novel in 2029, and I was obviously playing with the collapse of the stock market exactly 100 years
October
earlier.
29 as well, yeah.
Yeah. I may have got the date too late. You know, I think that the U.S. especially is playing with dynamics that nobody understands, and on a level that's never been experimented with before. I had reason for my new column to look up the federal budgets for 2020 and 2021, and oh my Lord. I mean, the proportion of deficit to earned income, if you will, revenue, is astonishing. It's not quite 1-to-1, but it's close. It's something, the projection for 2021 is that the budget will be 5.8 trillion, something in there, and something like 2.7 trillion of it is debt. The scale of that is astonishing, and it's not a one-off. A lot of people don't understand the difference between debt and deficit, and I wouldn't condescend to your viewers that they don't. But the deficit is going to keep repeating. And if you take a look at the obligations of the government, they keep increasing. I mean, that's one of the things that I tried to portray in The Mandibles, is that's one of the things that tips things over is entitlements. And, you know, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And these burdens do nothing but increase. And they are big expectations for the American citizenry. You know, you don't, you know, you're going to get your damn Social Security because you paid into it. And a lot of Americans imagine that they've kind of got this little bank account growing that they paid into, and then they're going to get it back out. And that's unfortunately not the way it works, because your contributions have already been spent. And as for Medicare, which I myself am starting to look forward to, you know, most Americans are holding their breath until they qualify for Medicare. And that it's like, oh, right? Finally, our healthcare costs are somebody else's problem. But of course, they're not really, because you need overall solvency to be able to count on that. And I just see insolvency at every turn. And I'm afraid maybe I'm just old fashioned, but this modern monetary theory thing just sounds like a plain old Ponzi scheme, you know, a plain old scam. It is absolutely impossible that the government can simply print as much money as it likes to pay for everything, and you don't have to cover it with taxes. And everything's going to remain fine, and those dollars are still going to be just as valuable. It's just, you know, if you think about any quantity that has some value and you reproduce it infinitely, it goes down in value. You know, if you produce too much corn, then the price of corn goes down, and it often below the cost of production. So, I mean, at least money technically takes very little money to produce.
That's the problem.
It does go down in value if you make too much of it. And I think that's just, we're acting as if we're living in a different economic universe.
We've seen it before in Weimar Germany, in Venezuela, in Argentina, and all sorts of places that did experience hyper inflation. But you're right. And this is, to me, is the key, I guess, Rubicon that we've crossed here. We've gone from, oh, look, we need to spend a lot now, but we'll pay it back later. She'll be right. We'll grow out of it, to modern monetary theory, which is this idea that not only is printing all this money consequence-free, it's actually the economically responsible thing to do.
One of the things that it's dependent on is interest rates basically being at zero.
Correct.
But one of the conclusions I have drawn from the last 15 years is that capitalism doesn't function with zero interest rates. I mean, if you can just borrow money indefinitely, then why ever earn it?
Yeah.
You know, borrow, die. And and we have incentivized debt. I mean, and lots of, if you look at the nature of the stock market, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's staggering, the percentage of money in the stock market that is leveraged.
Yeah.
It's borrowed money. And we have incentivized people to borrow money to invest in the stock market, and that is creating a bubble.
And that's the parallel to 1929, the stock market crash. It's a very, very similar set of situations when you had this highly overinflated stock market, and one piece of that Jenga tower got removed, and we know the consequences then. I personally think we're in for something much worse than we saw in 1929. But in the novel, I was having a read through the novel last night to prepare for the interview, and I reread a scene in which Nolly explains complexity theory, and the explanation being that the bigger and more complex a system is, the more liable or the more vulnerable it is to complete collapse. Now, the novel's written about the
catastrophic collapse.
Catastrophic collapse, correct. I undersold it, but this is the thing. It all seems like a coiled spring to me. When you look, the Nandles was written about the US. When you take a look back and look at the arc of history and the historical time that we're in, to me, it's like the interwar period. You have, economic vulnerability, certainly, but you also have fear and loathing between countries and this weird sort of autarky that's grown up around Corona. You have a web of confected or otherwise racial, religious, sectarian, national tensions. Something's got to give, surely.
Well, on that complexity theory business, there's an analogy. I've read a little bit about it. You know how you can build a pile of rubble remarkably high. You keep adding stones,
yeah.
and it remains fine.
Yeah.
And then you add one more. It's basically another camel's back kind of analogy. And then the whole thing just falls apart. And that is a way complex systems can work. And there's nothing more complex than both Western society in general and the world international
the interconnected
economy
world
right
in 2021.
Now. I mean, just a mess.
Yeah.
It's amazing, actually, that it works at all. But I think that, this comes back to our sense of complacency. The sense is, well, it's working now, so obviously it's going to keep working. It keeps working until it doesn't. And I don't enjoy this experience, but I have to say that I keep having this feeling of living before something horrible, and that changes everything. And I don't mean the coronavirus. It doesn't qualify. It's not bad enough. I would say that the response to the coronavirus has been an absolute catastrophe, but still not nearly on the scale that I'm talking about, although what we have done to ourselves economically as a consequence of overreacting to this pandemic makes what I'm talking about more likely. Now, I tend to imagine collapse being economic, but the truth is that problems never develop in a vacuum, and the consequences of a certain kind of collapse also have effects on other parts of society. Some of what I tried to express in the novel. So, if we have an economic collapse, it's going to be a collapse of everything else. And there is definitely a kind of center not holding feeling in the Western institutions having no faith in themselves, and also being distracted from what their core purposes are. And that's one of my biggest problems with the obsession with diversity. Is that you've got companies and arms of government and certainly universities they have completely lost a grip on what their purpose is. I mean, they actually think that what their prime goal is to be diverse rather than
some sort of public function.
A diverse workforce to accomplish something else.
Correct.
Right?
That
and this is incredibly self-destructive. I mean, I don't get the impression that a lot of universities are genuinely educating their students anymore.
They're not, and we've got reams of research here at the IPA to demonstrate just that. But you're right, and you've nailed what has unsettled me over the last few months. Certainly, ever since I read The Mandibles, I have to say, in isolation last year when I was going crazy anyway. But to me, it does feel like the eye of the storm we're in. We had all the business with Corona and everything else. But one thing that struck me about the novel was, for all its dramatic predictions about what could happen in the event of a currency collapse and an economic collapse that you described, there is a very eerie realism to it, and I think it's the pace in which it happens in the novel. It's as Hemingway said, it's gradually and then suddenly. Now, spoiler alert to anybody watching, but to flash forward to the end of the novel, you have freedom in the United States eroded to the extent you have a 77% income tax. You have all transactions monitored with a chip behind the neck that's implanted in people. You have guns confiscated. You have all sorts of things. Now, that was written in 2016, as I said. We fast forward 4 or 5 years, and you have also written extensively and correctly about coronavirus restrictions and the hitherto unthinkable cascade of extremely invasive limitations to our personal freedoms that have resulted from that. I mean, do you think we have crossed a Rubicon here? Do you think this has really softened us up for whatever comes next?
I do not believe that Western governments will ever be the same. I don't think, I mean, I'm prone to catastrophizing, but I don't think that's at all an exaggeration, that both government and their peoples have discovered that all of the principles on which Western governance is built are rescindable. And anything that can be rescinded once can be rescinded again.
Correct.
And again and again. I mean, the rhetoric is especially conspicuous in the UK, where we're having our so-called freedoms returned to us one by one, but only if we're very good.
Yeah.
And with the understanding that if we're not very good, they will be removed from us once more. Boris Johnson is already softening the British up for another lockdown next autumn. Now, I don't know whether he'll go through with it, but he's already laying the rhetorical groundwork for "I told you so," or I warned you that this was only for now, and don't get too excited just because you have vaccines. They're not the way out, because we have to worry about variants. And this variants thing has just been a get in jail free card.
Yeah, correct.
Right? Because the variant that evades the vaccines is theoretical, it is eternally terrifying.
It's open-ended, correct.
It's like a boogeyman in the closet, will never go away.
No.
And so this is pertinent to Australia. I mean, you could kiss air travel goodbye for eternity. You will never be released because there might be a variant.
And we can thank you for one of those, not you personally, but one of those variants that we're terrified of is the UK variant in Australia. Now, there was a lockdown in Brisbane, a few months ago because the UK variant reached our shores. Literally one person got it, but that doesn't seem to matter because, as you said, and this is what gets me, it is the transformation of our freedoms from a right to a privilege, and the fact that society appears to have acquiesced to that for the most part because of, a virus. But if it's not corona, it will be something else. But it's also the circularity of it, which is, well, you better lock down and you better obey the rules because otherwise we could have more cases and then there'll be more lockdowns and you'll lose freedom. You'll be put in timeout permanently and so on. I mean, this is the feedback loop that we're in. I don't know what can throw us off track now.
I don't either. And I have actually found deeply depressing. And I know that, I mean, that sounds like a bland thing to say, but I mean it personally, that it has profoundly affected how I feel on a daily basis. And in general, it has changed how optimistic I feel about my future personally, as well as the future for all of us. It has transformed my relationship to both countries I spend time in. And, you know, as I said, I'm not a very active, expressive patriot, but I find my affection for both the UK and the US has palpably waned and sometimes descends to contempt. And it's not a nice feeling. I really don't enjoy it. I'm into darkness as entertainment, right? I mean, that's my stock and trade. And therefore it's kind of out there. It's like you can literally shut the book on it and go pour yourself a drink and have a good time.
Yeah.
And this is different. This is a darkness that has really penetrated how I see people. And I have been so deeply disappointed and frightened, genuinely frightened, and not of that bloody virus. But, you know, the British, for example, have all kinds of vanities about World War II, and hitherto I've considered them well earned, at least by previous generations. And you know, they've got that plucky stood up to Hitler and defeated the tyrant thing. Okay, stood firm during the Blitz, and I'd previously been very happy for them to cling to that mythology. It's a positive mythology. It's a good mythology.
Yeah.
But now I'm convinced that, you know, Hitler would take about 2 weeks and he'd have the British in his hip pocket.
Yeah.
And I don't say that with any pleasure.
No.
And that's frightening. And we have found just across the board that Western populations have completely capitulated, and not only capitulated, but willingly and almost happily, and have become zealots for the new ideology, and have displayed no capacity for independent thought or even the ability to use the bloody internet. You know, I devote a lot of time. I imagine a lot of it is wasted to keeping up with dissenters, many of them very distinguished scientists who are constantly shut up by big tech. But the information is out there. I mean, big tech is not efficient enough of getting rid of it. And you know, there are now over 40 studies, international studies, some of them quite sophisticated, trying to pair alike with alike, demonstrating that there is absolutely no linkage between non-pharmaceutical interventions, i.e. lockdowns, and other stringent coercion, and deaths, or even other metrics like hospitalization. There's no connection whatsoever. It doesn't work.
No, it doesn't.
On top of being, you know, evil on every possible level, on a political level, certainly, in relation to other health metrics, definitely, but it doesn't even reduce what you're trying to reduce. It doesn't work at all. So, and yet you've got vast proportions of the population having completely bought in and don't question it at all. And there's a lot of this country. The main criticism of Boris Johnson is that he did not lock down hard enough or soon enough, and they don't want to come out of lockdown now. And their biggest concern is coming out too soon.
You know, for all the struggles of dealing with Hitler back in the day, you never saw the Western world or the free world emulate elements of German authoritarianism, whereas that's exactly what we've done in the West through Corona, borrowing from China. But I guess you're right. It's a bit like Florence in the novel when, you know, just after the Great Debt Reset, when there was sort of an interior monologue where she was reflecting on her own sort of patriotism or her attitude towards her own country. And it's this first feeling of dismay at what her government had done. I think that's what a lot of us are going through now, with seeing what, again, the Western world, what Australia certainly has done. And if you think you have it bad, at least you can leave the UK. We are walled in here like Prison Island, like it was.
I mean, probably with American passport, I can get out of here, but right now it is illegal to travel outside the country. You have
it
to
is.
have a reasonable excuse, and they've listed out 4 of them. And if you actually even head to an airport, you don't even have to get there. If you head to an airport without your reasonable excuse, you can be arrested and fined £10,000. So, I mean, I think what we've seen here is it's the final full circle of the left, and honestly, the Conservative Party, for example, has gone left.
Don't get me started. Don't get me started.
Right? The left has embraced authoritarianism. And it used to be, you know, that liberals used to be criticized for being too naive about human nature.
Yeah.
Right? They were pussies. They trusted people to do the right thing. And, you know, so that they never thought people would cheat on benefits because that would be wrong.
Yeah.
Right. People would never not work in order to get benefits because everyone wants to work. That's what we used to think of liberals. And now they've become cynical about human nature. And the only way that people are going to be good is if you make them be good. The left has embraced coercion.
And for reasons we've talked about, what we've done during Corona will precipitate the next crisis, I think. But you've nailed it perfectly in that these orthodoxies will fade away. And the title of this program is CounterCulture, because the way you and I are speaking now, it is on par, I think, with the counterculture of the 1960s. I think it will eventually, the wave will overtake what we're stuck with now. This will, as I said, self-correct, but it may be very painful along the way. But in the meantime, I commend this book to anybody with an interest in the future of the free world. As I said, it is a very, very important novel. And to you, Lionel Shriver, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and for joining us on CounterCulture this morning.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I really appreciate a plug for the book. The one thing lockdown's given us is lots of time to read.
Correct. Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Lionel. Talk to you soon.
Hope so.